do is I'm also going to make sure that I can see the chat in case you guys want to have a comment in the chat. I will have it open in front of me. And oh, resume share. Okay, sharing is paused. Can you guys see this? Hold on, sorry. This is doing some kind of nuts. It's the setting that I had the slideshow on, sorry.
Okay.
I had it in some kind of book version. All right, let's try this again. No. Yes.
Looks good.
Right. That you can see, and I can do it there, and I can see the chat. Thanks, Emily. All right, so as I said before, this is basically going to be an introduction to this idea called the Nature Futures Framework that IPBES has been working on for the past couple of years. And in essence, the outline of the talk is going to be a brief introduction to sort of what the Nature Futures Framework even means, starting off with sort of why IPBES or why the biodiversity community actually needs new scenarios in the first instance, the process that we've gone through from a very participatory perspective in developing the NFF, and then an example of some of the illustrative scenarios that we've started to create. And this is where I'm going to link to what I think is really awesome software called Twine that hopefully we'll be able to interact together to choose our own nature future. And we can sort of talk through that a little bit more. And then I'm hoping that that should take us sort of maximum half an hour, 45 minutes, and then we can open up for everyone's thoughts and inputs on how to move forward with this agenda. And then I just want to also really thank the task force for most of the slides that I've actually been using and adapted, because it was definitely, this is a group effort from the whole of the IPBES task force. It's definitely not just me who's been working on this. Okay, so to start off with, why do we even need new scenarios? So the IPBES, which sort of a brief introduction for those who don't sort of really know what it is that they do, is broadly speaking the IPCC for biodiversity, although that's not strictly true. It's a good enough analogy for now. And so their main task really has been to do assessment reports on sort of key questions that their governmental stakeholders have asked them to do. And so one of the first reports that came out together with the pollinator assessment was this methodological assessment of scenarios and models. And in essence, some of the take-home points from that assessment was that most global scenarios are limited to assessing the impact of drivers on BES, which is biodiversity and ecosystem services. So they're not actually inherently nature-centric. Very few scenarios actually talk about sort of desirable or normative target-seeking futures. Most of them are actually also developed for other purposes. So mainly within the environmental sphere, we tend to use the SSPs, RCPs that are developed mainly for climate and its impacts rather than for biodiversity itself. They also, at the global level, understandably, most scenarios lack a participatory or even a plural approach to sort of understanding what the future could look like. And then they also don't really adequately represent transformative responses. And so sort of trying to get transformation or transformative change into scenarios can actually be quite difficult at that global level. Then again, we had the IPBES Global Assessment, which some of you might be aware of, that came out in 2019. And again, sort of came up with this idea that currently available scenarios aren't providing diverse multicultural options that engage society globally in actions and lifestyle changes that can sort of bend the biodiversity curve, as it were. And that regional and global scenarios lack an explicit consideration of views, perspectives, and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So sort of that was a really big gap that was important for us to acknowledge and to try and address. And so that's kind of the starting point for like why we're actually sort of going on this madcap journey of trying to come up with globally relevant plural scenarios around biodiversity and ecosystem services. So what we started was a process that actually began in 2016. And there's a paper by Rosa et al. That sort of outlines the general plan that the task force, or the expert group at that time, came up with. And that started with this participatory process that we held in Auckland, New Zealand in 2017, where we brought 73 stakeholders from 31 countries together, including representatives of Indigenous communities, mainly from New Zealand, because of proximity, into this process. Generated these visions, which you can see as sort of phase one within this process, but that was very much limited to what the group themselves wanted to talk about. So it wasn't kind of completely holistic. There were specific sectors that people were interested in following up on, such as food, oceans, and freshwater. But it was a really good starting point to start to think about more creative, bottom-up, global narratives. We then went through a variety of different stakeholder engagement processes that I won't bore you with, but that kind of went through sort of just trying to test out these visions with different communities as they were associated with the IPBES. And then at an expert workshop in phase 3, there was the development of this Nature Futures Framework triangle, which I'll explain in subsequent slides. And then sort of work following from that has been further engagement with people, just particularly within the policy community, as to whether this kind of makes sense. And now increasingly more with the research community, especially modelers, to see whether there's a way to actually operationalize this from a modeling perspective. So it's important to have the qualitative narratives. Those are not easy, but are easier to do than potentially sort of quantifying some of these narratives, particularly because a lot of the metrics that we use in sort of quantification don't really capture a lot of the things that people actually care about, particularly from these more bottom-up pluralistic approaches. So that's been an interesting journey, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then this phase 5 was this consolidation of scenario narratives, which we realized actually we're going to be unable to come up with the set of global stories, but there's an illustrative set that we're saying this is one way that you could cut this pie. There are many ways that you could cut the triangle, but this is sort of one example that we sort of want to be able to sort of put forward to the community. This is still very much in prep, but it would be great to get some of your feedback on that. Okay, so the visions that emerged from Auckland, these were the 7 of them. As I sort of mentioned to you, they were very focused on particular areas that the groups were interested in. It was actually quite interesting that the Indigenous local sort of communities were really interested on staying in their own group rather than actually going into some of the other groups, and that they sort of came up with this culture vision that was sort of very much embedded within sort of their particular perspectives and ways of seeing the world, which we thought was quite interesting. As you can see, a lot of focus on food. There was this prosperity, well-being one. The marine environment was very important. Sort of looking more at the dynamics of nature to actually think more through a temporal aspect, and then kind of urban-rural flows. Like, what is this kind of urban-rural dichotomy that we actually tend to perpetuate when thinking about scenarios? Can we actually think more about flows between them? And this report has been written up. There's also a shorter version, a summary that you can go and check. But we also had a fantastic graphic artist, as you can see with us, who was able to illustrate some of these visions. And so the Nature Futures Framework Triangle was born during this one meeting, as I said, of researchers that happened in 2018 in The Hague. We realized that these 7 visions actually kind of mapped quite interestingly onto this triangle of kind of a desirable or positive sort of relationship with nature. And so there was this idea, and this sort of, it maps onto different value perspectives that I'll explain a bit later, but this idea of the importance of nature for societal benefits, right? For our food, for our sort of the ecosystem services that we derive from nature. There's also an important component of just nature for nature, sort of its own intrinsic value, sort of separate from humans actually having to be involved. And then there was this other important component of the triangle, which is a lot more difficult to sort of get our heads around. But this idea of nature as culture, where you're not even separating nature and society, where you're looking at a much more relational sort of value for nature that's embedded in sort of many non-Western cultures, actually, and that we tend to struggle a bit when it comes to doing research that's sort of been perpetuated in this idea of thinking of humans and people and nature as separate. And so this nature as culture is sort of trying to get a little bit more sort of openness to those different perspectives. So again, sort of everything in the triangle is kind of seen as this desirable, this positive space. It's a relative triangle, so obviously everything is sort of relative to everything else. You can choose the dot at any particular point in time where you're emphasizing maybe a little bit more of a nature for nature value, but it will still be relative to culture and society. And so the idea is that everything outside of the triangle is sort of kind of a current trajectory that's not actually valuing any of these values in appropriate or desirable ways. And again, sort of the delineation of this triangle is quite fuzzy. Sort of what is in, what is out, what is at the borderline is definitely open for debate. But it's still the interesting thing was that it was a heuristic that actually resonated with the modelers in the room. And so, you know, it's not often that you're able to sort of get a set of qualitative, more social science researchers together with much more quantitative natural science researchers to actually agree on a figure where all of them sort of vaguely understand that it could be useful in the work that they do. And so you do lose a lot of the deep nuance and a lot of the scholarship that has gone into sort of valuing nature to sort of the critical social science perspective. But we sort of thought that by encapsulating this as kind of a heuristic device, that you could go into that kind of depth if you wanted to, but you could also just sort of use this space to make sure that you were including, or at least taking into account, the diverse values when you were, for example, coming up with a model, or the kinds of metrics that you'd be using. So we can definitely, you know, we know what food production looks like. We know what sort of ocean fisheries are able to provide us. A lot more difficult sort of quantify or think about what my identity as a fisherman actually means to me from a cultural perspective. But as soon as you look at the triangle, you realize that that is a component that you need to also be thinking about. You can't just be looking at sort of number of fish caught from different fisheries. Okay, so this is just going into that a little bit more detail. You can see some of the other sort of phrases that we use to describe these corners. Is sort of this living in harmony with nature, people one with nature, a lot of the ecosystem services and nature's contributions to people idea still sits around that nature for society side. And then the nature for nature component does capture intrinsic values for nature, you know, nature for itself, but also, again, because we are humans working in this, it's kind of still difficult to really define that area, but we're always trying to get as close to that as we possibly could. And as I mentioned, this also is in line with the IPBES sort of conceptions of values. So there's an entire assessment that's being worked on this, but in essence, sort of they've sort of spoken about this. This is so sensitive. Intrinsic sort of value of nature, sort of much more instrumental values of nature, and then relational. So this kind of maps quite nicely onto the triangle. But I think what we also were a bit cautious about is that, yes, you can map these quite nicely onto the triangle, but we don't want to be limiting it just to these particular sort of values. And so we speak about a value perspective of nature as culture, a value perspective of nature for society, and a value perspective of nature for nature, which can incorporate these different values, but we don't want to be limiting it to just like actually talk about these as individuals, because again, they're not isolated, they're relative to each other. Which can be quite difficult to communicate in papers. So any ideas that you have on that, more than welcome. So yeah, as I mentioned, the Nature Futures framework, I sort of like to talk to it about, and I don't know if Jan's on the call, but about being extreme relativity. So the edges are kind of extreme versions of what if you took these different value perspectives to kind of the absolute extreme, what would still be seen as a desirable future, what would still be seen as inside the triangle, and that all of the space, all of the different kind of relational components of different values mixing together within the triangle then opens up almost an infinite amount of different configurations that you have. And so really the tough job that we have for us is to sort of try and define some conceptualization of what this extreme boundary relative to all these different values is. And I hope that makes vague sense, because sometimes I don't understand what I'm talking about when I talk about this. So in essence, the triangle is a relative space which captures all possible combinations of what desirable nature values could be. And it also provides the extreme edges of underlying values for nature that sort of we hope to be able to use to actually shape the resulting narratives or storylines that we're planning to develop as a scenarios community. And so comes the big task of operationalizing the Nature Futures framework for a new generation of nature-centered scenarios and models. So the idea is that we're going to try as a task force to develop a toolbox that will help other researchers to be able to actually use this in some kind of a way that's useful to them. So our job is to catalyze the development of these scenarios and models, not to necessarily do it all ourselves, which is also a fine line that we have to tread. I think in these initial stages, we're going to have to be quite heavily involved as we also sort of work our way through actually understanding what this means. But sort of some of the main gaps that we've identified is that particularly for modeling approaches, the NFF sort of needs new indicators, right? Especially nature for culture values. We just don't have as many of those indicators as we really need to be able to do this well. We need to incorporate social ecological feedbacks into our scenarios and models. We need to look at kind of the relationships between biodiversity and ecosystem services. So to go back to sort of what is it that the diversity of the biosphere actually provides us in terms of meeting some of these different needs. And then also look at sort of drivers, both direct and indirect drivers of change on biodiversity itself, but also on good quality of life. That's what GQL stands for, which is sort of the IPBES terminology for well-being in essence. And then again, sort of this need to realize that there's a diversity of landscapes and seascapes that we need to be able to take into account, even at the global level. And so this plurality is important, but this need to be operational across multiple scales and at least have some level of coherence in a bottom-up rather than a top-down way. So currently, you know, we tend to have a way of taking global scenarios and kind of downscaling them to again, this thing is so sensitive, and downscaling it to the regional or national level. But this is more about how do we actually take the plurality of bottom-up futures and still have a set of interesting sort of global indicators to work from, especially when you're looking at how these are used, for example, to negotiate the conventional biological diversity. You know, you kind of need that at the global level. We need these global targets that we're actually looking to agree on as a global community. And so there is still very much a need to look at this at the global level, but not to lose the nuance and the context, that sort of the richness of narrative that you get within much more embedded stories. So no small task, really. Okay, so moving aside from the modeling work, which is still very much a work in progress and which I'm definitely not the expert in, I think probably the best example of progress that we've made is with these illustrative scenario or illustrative narratives that we started to develop. And again, coming back to this idea of extreme relativity, what we decided to do, and you can ignore the numbers, it was just my inability to sort of work linearly, is to sort of take sort of 1, 2, and 3, which is nature for nature, the corners or the vertices of the triangle, and then to also take some of this interesting meeting together of sort of 4, 6, and 7, which is like what is an in between nature for nature, nature's culture kind of world look like? Yeah, and so this idea of being able to come up with 6 narratives at the extreme corners, of which you could think of, there could be any combination of these kind of in between, but at least you've got a bit of a richness of these sort of extreme worldviews. So these are the starting points. And you can see why there's 1, 2, and 3. 5, we actually started off having a 5 in the middle, and then realized that was just kind of the Goldilocks happy spot. Everything is just perfect. We don't sort of have any extremes. And I've got ongoing discussions in the task force. I'm like, that's never going to happen. That's just not a perspective that we can necessarily easily do. I'm also not sure whether it's useful. Other people do think that it might actually be useful to explore, but because I was designing this process, we don't have the spot in the middle, and we can maybe talk about what that could look if we were to develop sort of a 5 in the middle. Okay, so we got together as a task force in Japan this time last year, just as COVID was sort of going mad. And so there was a much diminished task force that managed to meet. But in essence, sort of the starting points for our process was that we'd come from this participatory sort of visioning process. We'd done a lot of stakeholder engagement. There needs to be more participation sort of going forward, but we realized that you're not going to be able to come up with narratives, or at least a starting point in a participatory process. We needed to actually come together ourselves as a task force to at least have a starting point for these narratives. Again, this idea of needing to try and work relatively well across multiple different scales was important. This idea of needing to be desirable, positive, that we're trying to stay within the happy triangle space, not sit outside it. This need for being able to still capture plurality and diversity was important. And then a really sort of key aspect of this was this need to also be transformative. And that kind of takes me to this next slide, which is, could we somehow use these narratives as a way to incorporate some of the ongoing debates that are happening in the research academic community on what transformative interventions could actually look like for nature and people. And so we haven't done a full literature search of this yet, but sort of just based on the expertise in the room, sort of we had a realization that, okay, governance, you could do governance in a centralized top-down fashion. It could be polycentric, it can be locally involved. It can sort of involve a lot of indigenous, sort of different indigenous ways of looking at governance systems. From economics, you have everything from degrowth being important to sort of looking at decoupled economic systems, well-being economies, solidarity economies, Green New Deals, blue growth, green growth, sort of all of these different ways of thinking about, this is the way that we're going to solve the future from an economic perspective, of which there is a lot of literature out there. And we thought that it was important to be able to capture that, because we tend to sort of default to existing sort of neoliberal capital ways of thinking about the economy in the future, which is, I don't think, necessarily helpful for decision making. There was also an angle of looking at land and sea use. So there's an ongoing debate on what we call sort of half Earth, which is about set aside half of the Earth for nature and sort of leave humans off of that. I think a lot of people who work in food are familiar with the land sparing versus land sharing debate. There's a sort of big focus on sort of rewilding, restoration. So thinking through sort of land and sea use as another way to get these different debates onto the agenda. And then, food production systems, even just getting down to that nitty gritty. Everyone is saying, there's a lot of advocates for sustainable intensification, which sort of sit within the land sparing side of things. The agroecological sort of camp sits a little bit more in the land sharing idea, that we need sort of high tech, low input farming within cities, that we need to be more artisanal, So all of these different ideas that people have about what a better future could look like, we needed to try and incorporate as best we could into these narratives. And so they're not perfect. Obviously, you could also do many of these and put them into different parts of the triangle. We only got to do it once because these were an illustrative set. But hopefully, with the pathway discussion that I will be able to share with you later, you can see how we may be able to incorporate some of these ideas, sort of how you could sort of mix a different combination of these ideas together and potentially land up at a different spot in the triangle. Okay, so with the 6 narratives, again, you can see this we had this like eureka moment of seeing that that sort of a combination of sort of nature for nature, nature society gives you 7. So 1 + 2 is sort of 7. You need to make sure that that 7 is actually a good representation or a good middle road between the story being told in 1 and the story being told in 2. And then at the same point, 7 needs to be diametrically opposite the story that's being told in 3, because again, they're relative to each other. Yeah, so so that was a really interesting sort of process that we had when we actually started developing the narratives, is that we realized that we needed sort of one person in charge of each, and they would go and have like one-on-one meetings. So like if I'm in charge of nature for nature narrative 1, I would need to talk to all of the other ones to see like whether my story was actually opposite from the story that was being told in 4, and that it had a good combination of what 6 and 7 kind of had on offer. if that makes sense. So sort of really making sure that the stories we were telling were relative in that way. And so the example that we have here is just around protected areas, sort of as a percentage land allocation. And so nature for nature, which is very much this this kind of half earth, leave people off the land sort of idea, was that you had about 70% sort of no take protected areas. Sort of the people were highly clustered in cities, so sort of looking at strong land sparing and urban only populations. You can see kind of opposite to that is sort of 4, which talks about high biocultural services, urban and rural areas, sort of very polycentric kind of nodes all linked together. There is some level of protected area, but these are very much in co-managed landscapes. And that's to put it in a relative between 3 and 2, where in 3, you have no protected areas. This idea of actually keeping people off land is just complete anathema to this whole idea of nature as culture. But you then sort of relative to nature for society, where actually you still need to be using most of your land for food production, for example, but you still see the use, for example, for tourism to actually have some protected areas for megafauna, things like that. But it's very much seen as a service for people. So this is what we did with a variety of different indicators and variables. And so we came up with some of these titles, and you can see that we've got the different names for these stories that I will sort of share later. 2-line summary on what these worlds kind of mean and some of the key words. So you've like high tech happening in ecology. You've got a much more collaborative commons happening in 4, for example. This is not necessarily that helpful for you if you haven't actually seen the narratives yet, which we will go to Twine to look at. But so again, this sort of the idea was to be able to talk to some of these ongoing narratives or these ongoing discussions that are happening within the literature. Sort of this half earth versus whole earth debate, to be able to situate these stories within that and to sort of make explicit some of the different trade-offs that would be clear. Both of these could be seen in a positive light, but then you're definitely going to have some trade-offs in terms of different value perspectives that you're able to perpetuate from one in one viewpoint and not in another. And then a big thing, just sort of wanted to put in SSP1 here, which is the Taking the Green Road sustainability scenario that tends to be used at the global level, which sort of talks about sort of gradual shifts around more inclusive development, management of the local commons with an emphasis on human well-being, and equality is reduced. You can kind of see how these 6 narratives go so much further than that in terms of actually talking to sort of human nature relationships. And so that was definitely at least meeting one of those requirements, which was to move beyond just these SSPs or these climate dominated stories as a way to think about environmental futures. So the next steps is about finalizing these narratives, and I've got some short descriptions that I will read to you guys once you've gone through the Twine exercise. Just to give you a sense of what those features look like. The next big thing is to develop pathways. So not just about these endpoint stories, but also the pathways of how to get from now to there. What are the things that need to happen? And we actually also, at the same time as developing the illustrative narratives, we also developed some baseline sort of historical to present narratives. So we have that kind of present baseline from which we actually can start to develop these pathways. To look at potentially quantifying drivers and responses, and then also quantifying impacts on biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. So that's sort of bringing in the modeling community to see if we can make an alignment between these different processes. So pathways, yeah, using the triangle, think about getting from the present into sort of a much more open space across the triangle. Think of there are multiple different pathways that we could use. This is the figure that we use to demonstrate that, though it doesn't always make sense. It just looks what we call the spaghetti diagram. But the idea is to go from sort of our current business as usual, where we're not really fulfilling the full space, into something that is sort of a lot much more encapsulating of the whole triangle. And that, as you can see, is not just about sort of going to the edges, but can also maybe think about sort of more configurations that sit within the center of the triangle. One way to think about this, and this is sort of an adaptation from the 1.5 degree report that looked at development pathways, is to say, you know, you've got this business as usual, but sort of if you were to go onto a more sustainable trajectory, you could potentially think of a nature for nature, nature for society, nature as culture pathways of which of course they would be extreme, but at least they would be something a little bit more broad than what you currently have in terms of a business as usual versus a green sustainable pathway. You're at least opening up a little bit more plurality there. And so we went to the 3 horizons approach, and this was just a mock example that we did in Japan. We thought that we needed to actually finish off the narratives first before we did the pathways. So we haven't actually done those yet, but the idea would be that if you sort of, I think most people are familiar with the 3 horizons framework, but in essence, it's about looking at the 3rd horizon, which is sort of, if you've got time at the bottom, sort of things that currently aren't dominant within our system, with the y-axis being sort of dominance of the current system, that if you were looking to sort of build those up into this like vision of the future that you really, really want to have, at the same time, what you need to do is take the 1st horizon, which is the present system, and think about things that actually need to decline, right? So you actually need to change the current system. For example, fossil fuel-based energy systems need to decline, while sort of fundamental sort of 3rd generation biofuels, which are currently non-dominant, need to really build up into the future. And so this is where you actually have this idea of transformation happening, right? Because you're breaking one system whilst building up another system. And that 2nd horizon is the pathway. It's where that messy clash of like how you actually go about doing this works. And the idea that you can see with these really bad, clearly drawn in PowerPoint dotted lines is that there are multiple pathways that you could use to get to this feature again, and that there are different like bifurcation points of sort of choices that can be made that can take you down one path rather, compared to another. So idea is like using this as a heuristic. Can we think of ways to actually help think through from a modeling perspective what some of these bifurcation points would be, what some of these sort of almost as a decision tree to get towards these different future points could actually look like. And so we started off just really quickly in an Excel spreadsheet with ecology, that Nature for Nature one, to think about, okay, what is it that's growing? And sort of we came up with the idea that artificial meat technology, you need a sort of a quantum leap in terms of that kind of technology if you are going to have everyone living in urban areas. You need a lot of venture capital and crowdfunding. You probably also need sort of trends in urbanization to really happen at the same time as like a deep ecology movement, right? So there's this combination of factors. What needs to decline is sort of direct access to natural resources, mining, sort of agrarianization, all of those things that are keeping people on the land. You'd see a decline in that happening if you were going to be in these sort of very separate kind of worlds. And so the idea is sort of to build up these sorts of pathways going forward. There was also a key idea to like make sure that we also are very aware of the kinds of conflicts that could emerge. If technology is shared versus if it's not shared, could be a key bifurcation point of going towards a positive future versus a much less positive future. Otherwise you have some people that are left behind literally in the wild in this instance. So to also think through a little bit of what the implications could be of landing up outside of the triangle if you were to take some of these narratives to the extreme. Okay, so now we have much more fun, engaging entertainment than listening to me. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to look at your faces again. And good to see some people. What I wanted to share with you, which I thought was actually kind of super interesting, is this platform called Twine, which is basically for building choose your own adventure stories, or at least that's how it was sold to me by Sam Big-Messenger. And what I want to, so I'm just going to share that with you on the screen, and then it's going to you need to be participatory because I'm going to ask you questions that you're going to have to follow. So be prepared to actually take part. There's only so much talking to myself that I can do. So it's a pretty high threshold. Can everyone see this now? Yeah. So in essence, as you can see, can I? Yes, I can go down. Great. So it's basically a decision tree, right? So you start at the top and you sort of you make different decisions along the way, which is basically the same thing as building one of those pathways, and you're going to land up at some kind of point within the triangle at the end. So just to give you a general view of like what this could look like. And so we're going to play it now. Yeah, you guys can all see that. Okay, so it is the year 20, no, it is the year 2021. I need to change that. The year 2021 was a lot further away, but you get to choose your best nature future. So I need to choose whether you're super excited to explore the triangle or if you're going to get back in the spaceship. I'm gonna open
We're
up
excited.
chat.
Excited.
Yay, that's the right choice.
Excited.
Okay, so in this world, you either have high levels of urbanization that have left vast tracts of rural areas uninhabited, or rural development programs have been successful in limiting the growth of cities and people are returning to the land.
Probably good to reply in the chat, right? So we can get a sort of consensus.
I mean,
Yeah.
Consensus is overrated, but yep. Okay, we've got one for urbanization.
Rural development.
Rural development, one for rural development. Ooh, urban's winning. Rural's coming back. rural. Okay, all right. No, urban's back. No, I think you got to be quick off the mark here. We're going rural. We can always come back. Turns out that's the nice thing about decision trees. Okay, so Viva la Revolución. It's the middle of the century and time for a new economic paradigm. Either our technological advances have allowed growth in the knowledge economy, our economy is no longer determined by growth metrics, or we settle on a highly regulated economic system, green market economy, bio-based and centered on circularity. 2, growth metrics are dead. 2, no growth. 2. Okay, there's general consensus on this one. I think we're no longer determined by growth. Radical. Okay. So reconnecting with our ancestral heritage, I really need to work on my spelling here, sorry. And indigenous knowledge has allowed us to live in harmony with nature, but the scale at which our society, good Lord, sorry, at which our society is governed is still a question. So we have either returned to highly self-sufficient settlements based on our cultural heritage, with a strong connection to our land and seas, we're learning from our nomadic ancestors and making use of our technological advances. So we've learned to flow and be mobile with the dynamics of a changing nature and are no longer bound to living in one location, but live within social ecological units. Sorry, I typed this out really fast. Sorry, guys. So highly sufficient settlements, or where sort of nomadic dynamic. Nomadic ancestors, 2, 2, 1, okay, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2 nomads. Okay, I feel like the nomads are kind of winning. So we go there and you land up in dynamic natures. Yay! You can start your annual mobile village migration. So this is the image that we put together for that. And because this is the one that you guys chose, we'll land that up with first time. We can also move our way back through the tree. I'm going to give you a really brief description of what that what the site 6 actually is. And I'm not going to lie, this is my favorite part of the whole of the diagram. I love nature as culture versus nature for nature. Okay, so really quickly, the illustrative narrative that we started to write for this is that this narrative sits between nature for nature, nature as culture. Human societies respect, value, and accommodate the dynamism of nature through both traditional and innovative lifestyles that take into consideration a polycentric world of communities that are defined by their ecosystem rather than their so there are therefore no more nation states. While there is limited global trade and resource sharing, there's a high level of cooperation between these autarkic units in order to ensure global compliance with global environmental legislation for the freedom of movement of all species and for regional knowledge sharing and governance. Water is identified as key to life, resulting in a strong demand for the recognition and restoration of the social cultural role of rivers as living systems. These now have a legal standing together with the environment as a whole, so rivers flow freely without impediment. People use local, less globalized resources within circular economies. Human settlements are dynamic, adapted to the movements of nature while being flexible, and some of them even nomadic. So adaptive dynamic transport uses tides, wind power, and new technology that's able to capture these forces, building on traditional knowledge. Travel by air and sea is enhanced. So in order to consume the minimum amount of resources, so people live in hobbit homes or in sort of mobile ships around the world, airships. Sort of community-driven demand for decentralized local control over resources. Diets are diverse. Blah blah blah. Fishing is limited to traditional grounds within EEZs. There's no protected area per se, but rather entire ecological communities are protected in sites, which is especially important for the conservation of migratory species. Every human feels connected to their community and values of reciprocity, harmony, and relationality, which characterize humans' relationship with nature. So that's the short end of that one. And so we've written all of those. Each of the 6 different stories, we have like 600 words, narratives and blurbs on that. And I can share the link to Twine with pleasure. Unfortunately, I think you actually need to download it in order for it to work, but I will share it with pleasure and see if it works. So yeah, basically dynamic nature is a spaceship-like boathouse to move where we wish. As you can see, image in the bottom right-hand corner was kind of what I was going for with that. But there's also bottom left-hand corner hobbit holes, which could be another thing. If you guys want to go back, we can do maybe, let's do an urbanization one quickly, and then we can sort of end off and floating hobbits, yes, dynamically floating hobbits. Cool, so I'm going to choose urbanization for you guys, and then I'm going to let you choose the next answer. It's now 2030. We continue to face high levels of biodiversity loss, and the world needs to come up with a solution. How must we designate protected areas to conserve nature? We need limited protected areas to preserve nature, but people still need to be able to access them. Like, we need space for nature, but we have to severely kick people off the land. Okay, we've got 1. Siobhan wants 1. 1. Come on, guys. Okay, Sarah wants to kick people off the land. I like that. 1, 1, 2. Okay, you guys aren't extremists. Yeah, we're going to protect nature, kick people off the land. Okay, no, limited protected areas. Okay, but then fine, we've got limited protected areas. How do we trade our goods? We either rely strongly on our extensive transport network for low impact international trade, where most goods can be found in most parts of the world, or our trade occurs much more locally, sort of connected to indigenous knowledge and ways of production. Yeah, for colonialism, yeah. Not quite that extreme. Two, local, 1 for 1. Okay, I can totally see the group. You guys are all sitting at that bottom left hand, sort of from 6 to 4 part of the triangle. I can tell. I'm gonna have to force you guys. Yeah, you do need avocados in Sweden, exactly. All right, so this is the innovative commons, sort of final one, which is 4. It sits between nature's culture and nature for society. There's a whole blurb on that. Like, we can go through that if you want, but I do think that the images, hopefully, I mean, this is literally just me going through it. Probably all of these I shouldn't have copied, but kind of you have a sense of some tourism for sort of megafauna bottom right, but still drawing largely on indigenous knowledge in terms of like housing, construction, sort of ships and all of that. What I will do is, instead of going through all of the options, I'll just sort of show you that if you chose international trade rather than local, this is the optimizing nature scenario, which you can see is definitely not about sort of nature protection. It's much more about transport and food and these sort of multicultural, multifunctional landscapes, not necessarily that connected to sort of different cultural practices. If you guys were spacing for nature, you then have 2150, and this is because we needed to do some asteroid mining for this actually to work. So we've been able to grow our tech industry without exploiting Earth's natural resources, but being so disconnected from the land has impacted our food systems. So we either have lab meat for the win, we need to use some of our land and seas for food production, or like, hold on a second, we actually don't need to keep people off the land. And that sort of brings you back to some of the cultural ones. But lab meat for the win lands you up in 1, which is very much that land sparing idea of mostly space for nature to do its own thing, sort of highly intensified, sort of urban high-rise dwellings that are still sort of ecologically functional, but that's our ecology. We still use some of our land. This is the 7 sitting between nature for nature, nature's culture, which is sharing through sparing, where you can see sort of a lot of nature kind of left to itself, but we have sort of greenhouses, vertical farming, some aquaculture, and air blimps. Very important in this scenario is how we travel by air blimps. That was critical that I had to put that in there. Where else are we going? Okay, so the nomadic ancestors we've already done. But our indigenous culture and ways of, highly sufficient settlements based on our cultural heritage gives us 3, which is the last one, which is reciprocal stewardship, which sits at that bottom left-hand corner, the nature's culture. And there is also a picture of Wakanda in here, because the idea was that it's not just about going backwards, but that we're still looking at a progressive use of indigenous local knowledge, that it doesn't have to just be about sort of going backwards, but that we really do want to have the strong connections to our histories and to our cultures within this. And again, you can see there's no sort of differentiation between sort of people and nature within this. It's sort of very fundamentally connected. So that's twine. I'm going to stop sharing. I think I've also reached the end of the presentation. Yes. So if you want to see that was the end. Thank you. I can stop sharing that. And sure, cheers, Joost. But yeah, so that's, yes, I'll send the link through now, see if this actually works for you guys. As I said, it could be a little bit more difficult. And now, Sarah, over to you. Questions, thoughts, ideas, if anyone wants to just chat. I think we have another 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, I think it's fine if people just maybe raise a hand, and then we can just do a session if everyone can ask questions that they have. I'm also going to try to share the twine in the Slack in case anyone there would be interested.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Hiya. Thanks, Laura. That was awesome. That was really, really interesting and inspiring, and wonderful possible futures that we might all end up in. One of the questions I have with all of this is this question about operationalizing it, because that's always the key thing, isn't it? It's fantastic coming up with these wonderful, creative models. And this is always a question I have. I mean, put it in context. I was just in the meeting before this one with like UKRI, Early Career Researchers Forum, and it's so technocratic. It's all about, the solutions for the future. It's about biotech. It's about smart technology. It's about AI. And that seems to be where the academic attention is. That seems to be where a lot of the policy attention just seems to be, that we're on this inevitable roll forward towards, quantifiable high-tech solutions. And, how we kind of pull this back and say, actually, there are still a lot of people who are engaging with nature and valuing it in a totally different way. Getting this point across to people, who have not shown up for the workshop, who have not, self-selected as interested in these options. How are you finding it, bringing these people on board?
Sure. So, I mean, actually, it's less difficult than you think. And I think that this is one of the really interesting aspects of this work, has been working very, very closely with modelers. Yeah. And so with people who really like to quantify, who are sort of putting inputs, outputs, these are the IAMs, decision trees around which a lot of governance decisions are made. And a realization from them that actually we're not going to be able to sort of reach the kind of end goals that we need to, unless we think much more deeply about some of these other connections. And so I think that's been a real strength to the process, just getting them to understand the triangle, right? To understand that whole space, and that, okay, we can put tech in there. That's not a problem. Like we can, there is that angle, but there, together with that, we also need to think beyond with other kinds of different relational values, other kinds of things, histories, stories that we want to tell. And so this is where, developing these narratives is a starting point, where people hopefully feel a little bit of hope and a little bit of discomfort in each of them. Yeah, and that those narratives can actually be quite powerful tools to get people on board if you're able to use a platform such as IPBES, where you actually, we have to take this through to the plenary for them to approve the Nature Futures framework, or at least to agree to it as an important way to start going forward, you're starting to be able to disseminate some of these underlying stories about what these different futures could look like. At the same time, working with modelers to get these kinds of much more diverse and plural conceptualizations of potential pathways forward into models, they have a lot of power. And so if you're able to actually destabilize even just some of the assumptions, for example, around the economy and how the economy functions, in some of these, to be like, okay, fine, there is this assumption we make. If we tweak this aspect of the model, we're able to at least not follow this set assumption. We can think about different ways of configuring the economy. And that's the work that we're currently doing at the moment, is working with modelers to see, yeah, sort of there's the low-hanging fruit of like tweaking things through to fundamentally doing entire new models that can actually take the full space into account, and to sort of push back on the kinds of metrics that we need to be using to measure progress. Again, sort of realizing that nature as culture is a really big gap when it comes to the metrics that we even have within the IPBES, right? And to just be able to have this as a framework and to put that down makes that very explicit and very difficult to ignore from a research community perspective. And I think that there is quite a tight connection between decision makers who are looking for how they're going to be negotiating, for example, the CBD. There's also the BB&J coming up for the oceans this year, that, you know, at least being able to provide a set of research tools and outputs that can counter some of those dominant narratives that are kind of set out there is kind of the main thing that we're really trying to do. The problem is that this takes forever. I mean, we've been doing this since 2016, 2017 now, and it is slow and it is painful and it is extremely argumentative, and I feel like I'm losing my mind half of the time because we're also all volunteers working on this. But I do think we've made quite significant progress in bringing modelers on board, and also getting some interest and excitement from some policymakers to sort of buy into this process. And I think if we're able to provide some of these tools and to also get the rest of the research community to at least use this as a heuristic around which they can justify some of the other work that they think is really important, you know, is to really galvanize that research community to be able to provide some of these alternative outputs, then hopefully we've started to make a few steps forward towards getting towards these futures. But again, yeah, it's a slow moving process.
I just maybe have a follow-on question, if that's all right. On the kind of operationalization and quantification side of things, and just like kind of comparing it to the context of the SSPs, just because we kind of have that as a established idea, right? So on one hand, I get the sense that the SSPs are, I mean, you spoke to the fact that the narratives are pretty broad and generic, and then the kind of quantifiable aspects of those, at least what's been out there kind of in the early stages of it, were even more broad and generic, right? And I get the sense that part of that was kind of limited by the tools that we had available at the time, and they've come a bit more since kind of the development of the SSPs. And then part of that might have been kind of a decision around, you know, however successful that might have been, like keeping it not value laden or keeping it interoperable or whatever. We, you know that that's probably not the case because a lot of assumptions go into those narratives, right? But I guess in terms of kind of working through the operationalization of this Nature's Futures framework, could you speak a bit more to kind of if you've seen that kind of similar tension in the development of the quantification pathways, and kind of how the work with the modelers is kind of like, what's the outlook for that? Does it seem like, does it seem like we have the tools available to kind of operationalize everything off the bat, or kind of what are the areas that are going to need more development?
Sure. So I think, first response is we haven't been able to quantify anything yet. So the first meeting with modelers was in January. And although we've had a lot of modelers as part of the process, I think they're also a little bit cognitively stuck in terms of how they could operationalize it. So sort of we want to include the whole community in it. So that's just the first caveat. That being said, I think the one benefit that the biodiversity community has over the climate community is that fundamentally the models that they have are much more nuanced and focused on local relationships. Yeah, so obviously you have IAMs, which are sort of trying to provide all of the sectors and looking at the impacts of that, but there are also a variety of much more local models that are more flexible to be able to play around with some of those assumptions. So I think that's good news from that side. And I think, you know, they'd be able to take in different assumptions, right? So basically you put in SSPs and RCPs in, which is a set of kind of specific metrics to see what comes out the other side. If we just feed in, if we're able to actually provide those, it could be relatively easy for those simpler kind of models to be able to take that on board. Obviously, this isn't about changing IAMs, which is kind of like fundamentally locked into sort of how their assumptions work. That would require, as that keeps on telling me, like 5 years of funding to do a whole new model. And I'm like, well, then why don't you just do that? But anyhow, you know, so that's one thing where I think we could move forward. So what we really need to do, and I think that this has become the chicken and egg, is they wanted to have this sort of generic set of general scenarios at the global level to start from. What is it like? Give us the scenarios, and then we'll be able to sort of quantify those and put that in. And going through this now, what we're calling illustrative scenarios process has shown us that obviously not everyone agrees on the fact that our ecology, all that sort of space one, nature for nature, is high-tech, land-sparing, half Earth, right? Of course, that's just one configuration of it. But again, it's a useful one if you're looking at this extreme relativity, which is the argument I keep on coming back for. So this is why we've now really started to push forward with trying to get a set of stories, get a set of some of the assumptions, some of the different dynamics or variables that would be important within those to say, let's play around with these. They're not the only way that you could use this, and to encourage people to also develop alternative sort of narratives. And that's again where the twine becomes useful, because hopefully you'd be able to, rather than me just playing around with this in half an hour, you'd be able to come up with decision trees that land you somewhere between some set of extremes, right? Where it's still a flavor of nature for nature, but actually you've managed to do that without kicking people off the land, for example, right? And that could hopefully be a decision tree that you could build, right? And once you have a decision tree, you have a model, in essence. Like, that's been my argument, is that basically this is a set of decisions or sort of choices that you make at different points, and they can be quantified, and they can also be just yes, no's, for example, you know. So I think that's one way of going about doing that. So sort of my main thing right now is to get these stories written up, get sort of some feedback on them, see if we can sort of see what the gaps in terms of the metrics are. So that's another big thing we need to actually look at, is just the indicators that we have at the global level just really aren't useful for nature as culture, for example. So like, how can we get around that? And there is a separate project that Sylvia Carlson-Finkhazen has been leading from Wageningen sort of on that. So, you know, all these things kind of need to happen in parallel, but we're hoping that this year some of these will start to fall into place to actually move that operationalization forward. But it's been a massive iterative learning curve for everyone, and all of these amazing academic egos, myself included, just fighting with each other all the time. But yeah, hope I think vaguely answers.
I think also Marika still had a comment to this.
Hey, thanks a lot. I think Max had a comment earlier. He wanted to ask a question. I'll go after him.
Thanks. It's true, but it's okay. Well, I mean, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Max.
One more.
Okay, thanks.
No.
So Laura, I'm super excited to hear about this work of yours that you've been telling us about earlier. Super fascinating, really excited to hear more about it. I think it's really interesting that this framework, that you've been thinking about these different worlds, especially taking into account that now there's a really big buzz in terms of that we need other countries to make commitments about including nature into the development. You know, this 50 countries that have decided that they want 30% of the land and water in conserved. And I think it gives us sort of something to hold on to work together with countries in terms of imagining these worlds, because as you know, I work a lot with Costa Rica, and it's so clear for them that they want nature-based solutions, but there are so many ways of being able to get there. And I think this is a way of showing them, okay, or seeing, okay, well, how could we actually do that? And as you know, we're thinking a lot about, what is anticipatory climate governance, and how can countries explore the future and link that to making decisions in the present. And I feel that some countries are just really ready to take this more positive approach. We always focus a lot on, also think about the dark sides of the future, but some countries are really ready to, explore how they really want to get there. And I can totally imagine on using the framework in our work with different countries. Thanks a lot.
Awesome, thanks, Marika. And yeah, I think that was exactly the impetus behind trying to do this, of recognizing this massive gap, to think about, okay, we know a lot of the bad things. We still need to talk about the bad things and where things can go wrong and where there are conflicts. It's not about saying, it's not about that. But if we keep on only thinking about the bad things, it's really difficult to think about the things we need to do in order to get onto better trajectories. So I think that this is really trying to hopefully spark some of that. And I think it's a simple enough heuristic to be understandable across multiple different groups. At least that's the response that we've had. But we do need to be careful in how we use it, because you can lose some of that nuance in the way that it's applied. But definitely key. We can make this the new CCAFs. It's CCAFs plus Biodiversity 101. I think that sounds good.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I think Lise and Sean and Max want to say something. Right?
Maybe very quickly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so was there in one of the figures there was you showed that there needs to be a decision between present decision, and one way was business as usual, and the other one was towards the scenarios in a way.
Yeah,
and
that was the 1.5 degree reports.
Right,
again.
right. Okay, I was wondering about that. So there, basically, it excludes that there is no more business as usual. Is that like an explicit statement, or has that ever come up that people said in either way there is never going to be a business as usual? It's going to change. Whatever we like, either we change or we will be changed in a way, but there's no business as usual basically.
Okay, so I
has
mean,
that ever come up?
Not necessarily in our meetings. I think, so that's a bifurcation diagram, which is basically drawing on what the climate community sort of sees as a business as usual. We continue on the ways we are, versus we bend the curve. So there's this idea of bending the biodiversity curve. We sort of do things better.
Right.
And so we can do projections, business as usual, if we continue. I think that that's where a lot of modeling capacity has gone into generating. So I think we have a good sense of what that is, or what it could be. Also knowing that transformations happen, right? That nothing is linear when you think about the future.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that's difficult to sort of get a lot of modelers to think about. So I think it's useful to also be like, if we continue like this is a linear projection. It's not going to happen, but we can still come up with the figures of what that looks like. What's much more difficult to do is that bifurcation, which is the transformation. So this is, as I said at the beginning, one of the core rationale for doing this work is to think about transformative change, because that's also an assessment that's coming up for IPBES. And so that fundamentally means breaking away from this linear sort of going forward and thinking about, okay, if we were to think about transformations that had a more desirable or positive outcome for humans and nature, what could that look like? And that was sort of what that figure was supposed to be trying to demonstrate there, is that you could use the triangle to start coming up with the multiple different options that emerge from that, right? So it's not just one pathway, that it is still trying to be plural, but that it's very different. It's transformed from this kind of linear projection. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. never mind. We don't have time, I guess, but yeah.
Okay, yeah, but I mean,
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
get away from understanding of a lot of modeling, just projecting linear ideas of the future is a big task to try and get the community to even
Right, because I think
conceptualize.
the basic assumptions of these linear models, like they exclude so many factors that
Yeah.
they ultimately are just an imaginary in themselves. Like in so many cases, it's just unrealistic.
No, for sure, for sure.
Yeah.
But I think what we're trying to do is put our effort into understanding that, but knowing that it's not necessarily a huge argument that we can make, and think more about, okay, if we are thinking about the transformations that we know are going to happen, can we think about the kinds of different trajectories that those could look like and what would need to happen there? Yeah.
Thank you.
Lise, I think, was next.
I just wanted to say thanks a lot for sharing this, because I'm working with TU Eindhoven on a big interdisciplinary project where we're making scenarios for the Dutch energy and mobility sector. So it's not on biodiversity, but more on the climate side. And we're working a lot with agent-based modeling and a lot of engineers, and just assessing all these new energy technologies, mobility technologies, etc. And the idea was, in the beginning, to assess, you have all of these new technologies. There are a few social scientists also involved that research some values, and then you put all of that stuff in models, and then you can kind of say to policymakers, look, if you do this, then this will be the end output. If you do this, then this will be the result of that. And in that way, you help policymakers to make decisions. But what I found lacking, also being a social scientist myself, was kind of these more normative visions of futures, that like, how can futures look like? And maybe we should look at how do we want futures to look like, and then go back, perhaps. Or it should be, a movement from both sides. So I wanted to thank you for sharing this, and I'm very a lot of engineers, and there was in the beginning there are a few social scientists who can use one or two say to policymakers this, and this will be the was kind of this, how can futures look like, and maybe we should
Super, thanks, Lou. Sorry, my headphones just died on me, but I got most of that. And that, yeah, I mean, I think that this can be applied across multiple different sectors. I think the impetus came from biodiversity because the current ways of looking at modeling and scenarios just was not working, right? Because it is so grounded within place and connections that thinking of it at the global level just was not working very well. And so I think that that's why we started off with that. But I think it can be used across multiple areas. And the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project is really trying to do that a little bit more broadly. So I can chuck that. It's goodanthropocenes.net. I'll put the link in there, which might also give some more inspiration about other kinds of sectors that's also trying to do this little bit more normative visioning side of things. So cool. Sean?
Hi, Laura. Thanks for that. I studied the climate regime and how assessment is done there. So the fact that this exists at an intergovernmental body is astonishing to me. I was wondering if the process of, sorry. Now, I was wondering if this process of working on the Nature's Futures framework has exchanges, formal or otherwise, with other environmental assessments. So in climate or disaster risk reduction, or at UNEP with the GEO.
So funny you should mention that. So the Seeds project that I just mentioned, we got into the GEO. So in the last GEO 6, so chapter 23, you can see the slight chaotic configuration that I tried to build in to meet Detlef's IAM PBL model, and to get some kind of connection there and to realize where the gaps were. So the sort of bottom-up process has been incorporated there. Again, working with some of these key individuals like Detlef, right, who's been at the core of the climate and IAM modeling community. He's also been involved in the Nature Futures framework development, because I think they're increasingly realizing that they have these tools. They were good at the time when they really were needed, but we need to move beyond that now, because we've got different kinds of decisions and different kinds of information that we need to have available to governments. It's not just about we're in a climate crisis, they're bad impact. It's like, we know that now. Now it's a bit more about the solution-oriented space, which requires a lot more of this messy, normative, values-based kinds of discussions, which obviously models aren't really designed well to do unless you start bringing in these, and I'm really keen to start working on agent-based modeling and a kind of sort of individual decision tree kind of modeling, which you could get a little bit more of this nuance in. So the geo definitely worked. I think climate, less so because they are so locked into the SSPs. That being said, there was a workshop between IPBES and IPCC on the need to sort of work a little bit more closely aligned. And we do have on our task force some individuals like Ramon Pix, a few others who worked very closely in the climate community, but also people like William Chong, who's very sort of like well known for climate impacts on fisheries work, you know, so he comes from the biodiversity side, and they're really keen to see what sort of what operationalizing the NFF could actually mean for how they think about climate work. So I've sort of worked with a student, PhD student of Williams actually, who was trying to think of climate change impacts for biodiversity using the Nature Futures framework. So to try and combine some of these, there was work there is also a side work looking at whether we could link them with the SSPs in some kind of a way, to sort of actually do an analysis of what are the differences, what are the similarities, like can we make this argument a little bit clearer. So those processes are happening. Again, it's very much based on individuals and networks, as these things are, but I think the discussion is being had. I'm not sure whether we're going to see anything revolutionary in the climate space anytime soon, but hopefully if we're able to get this as an alternative method in, yeah, it will just open up a bit of space for something that's climate scenarios that's not SSP. So I've been working on some geoengineering stuff, which is also science fiction prototyping. I feel like it's the way forward, and we need a lot more of that. And we need these intergovernmental assessments to also realize that this is not storytelling, that this is really important kind of futures capacity building that we actually need everyone to be able to have. And I think the time is that's becoming increasingly pertinent and relevant to some of those bodies. But let's see if we get this through the plenary. I think that's going to be the big step. If the governments agree to the triangle, then we're already like well on our way. If not, then we got a bigger fight on our hands, I think. Thanks, Sean.
Right, if no one has a question, I have a question. Yeah, actually what I was wondering about when you showed the triangle, and I thought maybe you could give me some more explaining on that, because I sometimes really struggle to understand how we can have such plural visions of things, and basically putting that into an operationalization, because you need to make so many decisions which imply really narrowing down and going away from these plural perspectives. And you know, for example, people, nature as culture, it can mean so many things, and since nature can be so varied, so I really wonder how can you work with staying in a way plural but still having something which people can base their work on, you know. Sort of.
Great question. I don't know. I mean, we're trying. I think the main thing is really to bear this plurality in mind as you're writing and as you're developing these things. So, you know, you're not going to be able to come up with all the potential pathways, but don't just have one, have three, for example. And again, those kinds of bifurcations is like, we're not giving you the entire realm of what this possibility space is, but we're allowing you, again, that spaghetti diagram is trying to illustrate that it's not just one pathway, that you could get to multiple interpretations of this, to also really encourage other people to go out and do some bottom-up qualitative narrative storytelling scenarios within the triangle at different scales. So this is also how it's not just the plurality, but it's about the cross-scale interactions, the multi-scale needs that we also need to have to be able to just get people to get researchers, stakeholders, anyone who's interested to also generate some of those stories, at least if it's within some kind of vague heuristic of, I think the triangle is sort of diverse enough to be able to hold that, then you can actually start to see where those plurality sits, and that it's not bad that you have different visions, right? But that we need to be explicit that we do have different visions, right? Because until that point, we all think that we're on some meeting all the SDGs, meeting Agenda 2030 means that we're all going to land up in the same space. And we're like, no, there are fundamentally different worlds that emerge if you even manage to hit all of Agenda 2030, right? So I think that's yeah, it's just really being a little bit pedantic about that and making sure that the work that you do isn't locking down, that it is still going to give one narrative and maybe 3 pathways out of a potential infinite amount, but that you're very clear in the way you write it, that this is not it, right? But that this is an example that we can hopefully use to be more plural in the work that we do. Yeah. That's my kind of fluffy response to this. I mean, it's tough. This is what we're trying to do. No, it's a lot easier to write in a paper than it is to do in the real world.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Julie John. That's because they're not there because we haven't written them yet. So literally, what I was reading out was something that I finished off with my colleague Jan last week. So hopefully the narratives will be written up soon and put forward, and then I can share them with you with absolute pleasure. But it's still a negotiated work in progress. Sorry.
Is it fine if I have a small second question? Do we have the time for that? Okay, thank you. I was wondering, so I also, in our project, we looked at scenarios and futures of food, and it wasn't a systematic assessment what I did, but generally the impression of a lot of references, but also generally like media and public, if you type in the word future, similar to what you said, it's like it's a monoculture basically that comes up of like this high-tech something from some other planet where we are not here anymore, basically, almost. And I wonder how that's, so that's of course, it's a certain thing promoted by, I guess the people have interest in promoting this vision. At the same time, it doesn't reflect all the research that exists. Of course, we have imbalances in funding, we have imbalances in research. So a lot of funding goes into this type of techno future research also, or techno solution research that gets much more funding than your average permaculture research maybe. But I mean, also have you come across, or any of the people in the meeting here, anybody came across, is that a problem of framing and tagging and selling the research, or is it just a media bias, or like, do permaculture people just never say this is the future, we are doing future research, and is it just those techno engineers that immediately say, well, I'm researching the future, obviously? Like, is there a problem among the research community of what is future research? Because we are focused on like the organic farming research is solving an existing problem. It's not contributing to a future solution, maybe. Is that a framing problem? Or is it just how research is being perceived from the outside or being reproduced? It's something, it's just an impression that somehow, I was wondering if anybody has any ideas on that.
And I see Siobhan's commented in there.
I think it's a power problem. It's a power problem. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. It is. It's about who
has access to the attention, who has access to the funders, who has access to the decision makers. And I think that's also something which fundamentally has to change. And I think that's what's really exciting about these models, is that, that pluralism is not just about different types of futures, but it's about who is involved in creating those futures, whose voices are heard within us. So
that sort of the really great thing about being able to use the IPBES as a platform with this explicit task of catalyzing some of these different scenarios and models is that you can put the emphasis on where there are these big gaps. Not that there isn't research on this, but that it's local. So it's in a local journal, or it's like with a local NGO, this cool story that's been published that's never made it into world development or whatever. You know, so to be able to really emphasize this and draw it into a kind of a collective good, I think is important. But we've lost Max, but hopefully he got that link to some of the stuff we were trying to do. But yeah, fully agree. But Siobhan and I, we know that already. But thank you so much for all of your great questions and insights and comments. Like, it was less terrifying to try and present this clearly not fully fledged yet or implemented idea to a group, but I'm glad it resonated.
Yeah, I think it definitely did, indeed. And maybe we have time for one more question if someone has a question, but otherwise, I think, yeah, it's starting to be 2:30. So is there any more question? No. Okay, then Laura, thank you so much. I really think that everyone was super interested in what you were saying, and everyone was really, really happy that you did this webinar. So thanks so much. And thanks to everyone that came as well. I mean, we're now like half of who we were, but I'm going to try to share all the links that you shared in the chat as well in the Slack, so that everyone has them. And yeah, thank you so much.
And then YouTube, still terrifying, but okay, let's see how that goes.
True, I cannot forget the recording. Okay.
Guys, look forward to chatting with you on the Slack. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Laura.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Laura. It was really good.
Goodbye.
Yes.